Fireside Tales. Hello, I'm Merlin. Mililli. Welcome to my fireside, where I tell tales within tales, and we almost always get weird. And we drink coffee. So I normally drink coffee in my skull mug, but I couldn't find it. I have children. So this week I'm using As Above, So Below. I usually use my skull mug because I'm a deadhead, and that's why I have a skull mug. And every week here at Fireside Tales, I tell the story of the Grateful Dead, which is from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but it was told to me by word of mouth from a deadhead. Deadheads are people who really love the Grateful Dead, which is a band, a psychedelic rock band, or was. Now the remaining members travel around as Dead and Company. So, nonetheless, I tell the story of the Grateful Dead every week, as I heard it, from a deadhead by a fire, as it should be told. I also discuss with you reincarnation and the Akashic records. The Akashic records, or the Akasha, are an ancient set of records. It's an ancient library in which every soul has a book. It's a meditative library. You can only get there through meditation. Or perhaps, I guess, if you're just a spirit and not a body. Nonetheless, I keep saying nonetheless, I'll stop. Every week I talk to you about my book in the Akashic Records and how I've been going to the Akashic Records and looking in my book since I was a teenager, and now I'm in my 40s. So I've been gathering all this information, and I only look in my book in the Akasha. So I've been gathering all this information about my soul, and every week I share a little bit of it with you. The reason I tell the story of the Grateful Dead is because I think it's a story about reincarnation. And one of my objectives with this show is to teach people a little something about reincarnation, because I really don't think people understand reincarnation at all. And I think I understand it a little too well. Every week I discuss these threads that exist. They're coincidences, similarities in each life. And one of my threads is that I've been a psychic medium in past lives, and I am in this life. And the spirits have a theory about reincarnation. And their theory is that all the spirits who've been reincarnated have also been murdered. So therefore, if you've been murdered, you get to come back. But as a baby, it's not as a zombie, or you don't come back in your old body or any of that. It's not reborn like born again Christians. It's not like having a sex change. It's reincarnation. It's the body dies and the soul moves on into a new body, a new baby body that's born and lives lives, similar lives from what my experience has been. So in our first episode, we went back to the very last life I lived right before this one, in which I had a connection to the Grateful Dead, which is why I tell the story, of the Grateful Dead. I tell the story of the Grateful Dead also because it's a good reincarnation story, and it's a good story. So here we go. Once, long ago, there was a traveler. It was so long ago that she traveled on foot. She happened upon a little town where there seemed to be a little commotion going on. There was a crowd. As she got closer, she saw that the crowd was squabbling over a dead body. The traveler thought that this was rather disrespectful to the dead man laying there, whom they were squabbling over, directly over. And so the traveler stopped the townspeople and paid the dead man's debts that they were squabbling over, and paid for a proper burial for the dead man. And she prayed over his grave. And she traveled on. And many years, decades later, the same traveler from the beginning of the story found herself in mortal peril, from which a stranger came out of nowhere and saved her life. She said, "Thank you. Who are you? Where did you come from? Why did you save my life?" And the stranger said simply, "I am the Grateful Dead." Was the dead man from the beginning of the story. He was reborn. Decades later, he swooped in to save his savior's life. Because in a sense, she saved his death. A lot to be said for rituals around death. A lot of people don't like to go to funerals or don't like to talk about it, but really, it has to put the soul at ease to see your loved ones say goodbye. I suppose if no one says goodbye, then the soul gets a little teetery. Anyway, I think that the story of the Grateful Dead is a story about reincarnation. It's not a corpse that saves her life. Corpses don't save lives, they rot in the ground. Ghosts don't save lives, they float around. I think I'm writing a song. I do that. And music is one of my threads. I've done it in past lifetimes as well. And we've discussed that here. I've made music, I've composed music, and played musical instruments in past lives. And now in this life, I'm a musician and a composer and a writer and a director, a producer. So I've discussed my threads that I have from life to life. And I started, like I said, in our very first episode with my very last life, right before this one. But then in our second episode, I went all the way back to my very first life in my book. And now we've been making our way forward in the book to present day. So we started in ancient Peru. And in that very first life, I had an experience with interdimensional travel. And I also had an experience as a cloud bird after that, where I barely existed for what seemed like a really, really long time. Apparently because of the interdimensional travel business. Then I found myself in ancient Tibet. Then I found myself in ancient Egypt. Then I found myself in ancient Sumeria twice. That's something of a thread. I keep showing up in the same place or region that I left off in, which is interesting. Then I ended up in ancient Greece. And then there's this watermark in my book, which I discuss weekly here at Fireside Tales with you. And the watermark seems to be right when time changed from BC to AD, which I find interesting. So we may have lost a few years in there. Who knows how long I was out on that boat. But I boarded a boat in ancient Greece, and I don't think the boat was destined for ancient Scotland. But there weren't any other places to stop. Scotland was the only thing sticking out of the water. Everything else was underwater. England, Ireland, France, all of it was underwater from what my mind's eye has seen in my book. And what I see in my book is it's not like reading a regular book. I go to it meditatively and I touch it, at a certain region and its depths, and it's a big book, and it I have a memory from touching the book. So then I ended up in ancient Scotland where I was murdered. This seems to be a motif throughout. Like I said, it's the theory of the spirits, but I haven't been able to disprove it. I was murdered, and some of them were documented quite regularly, it seems. So then I had another interdimensional travel issue where I was born in another dimension and then I traveled interdimensionally here to this dimension to Old England, Ireland, Scotland, where I lived, and then I went back to my dimension and died in the dimension I was born in. Then I came back to Byzantium and Constantinople. Both are modern day Turkey or thereabouts, Istanbul, and which is two different time periods. Same region, twice. I keep doing that. France, then, was the next place that I ended up, and there I ended up twice. And twice I was burnt at the stake. So that's something that doesn't leave you, plus it's documented in history. So the thread of being born twice in the same place is there for sure. Then I was born in Italy twice, and England and France again, but then I died in America, but I was in Massachusetts, and then I died in California, even though I don't think California was California yet. Then I found myself in Austria, and then the last life I discussed last week here at Fireside Tales was in Boston. So I last left you in Boston, and then now we pick up again in Boston. I was born in Boston. And Boston strangely becomes a little thread. It's still, to this day, my favorite city. So it really starts to become part of me almost. So I last left you in Boston in around 1809. And today I pick right up where I left off, like I said, in Boston in 1809. And I was born a male this time to a pair of actors. My father left my mother with 3 children, and my mother continued to act, and we would have to go and watch her perform. She would buy us tickets for the front row, and we kids would sit there and watch her perform Shakespeare every night. And it definitely had an impact on me, and it's still, to this day, Shakespeare. I adore Shakespeare, and I can understand it. I've been able to read it since I was a small kid without needing cliff notes or any sort of anything to tell me what it means. I can just read it straight without an issue, and I love it. I the thing was, I watched my mom perform Romeo and Juliet as Juliet, and she would die every night and then take me to dinner. And I think I waited my whole life for her to come back and take me to dinner. When I was 3, she died. She actually died. So for little me, it was confusing. I thought she was going to come back and take me to dinner. And it became obvious that I thought that in my stories that I later wrote. Well influenced by Shakespeare and dead women who come back. So, this life that I'm discussing today, I became someone notable, a writer, and that is kind of a thread for me. My threads are art, music, stars, dogs, nights with a K, nature, mountains, math, writing, reading, push against the church. They burnt me at the stake. I have a little thing with them. Birds, angels, travel, Native Americans. I discussed my last life as a Native American. Well, the one before the one I'm discussing today. Last week's episode. Horses, the ocean. So in this life that I'm discussing today, I was Edgar Allan Poe. And there's a lot of mysterious things that I can kind of clear up for really strange reasons. And here I am, telling you weird tales every week. Threads. So, when my mother died when I was 3, I was taken in by a couple, a very nice woman who loved my mom, and a kind of a cruel man who did not love my mom or me or even his wife, really. He was a tobacco plantation owner. And he never adopted me. They never officially adopted me, but they did take me in. And they sent me right off to school kind of quickly. I was sent to England, I believe, to attend a really strange school in which I learned from the graveyard. We did math from the gravestones. Our PE was to dig graves. It was a morbid situation. I was in England, so it was always dreary and rainy and miserable, and I learned a lot of stuff, and I'm sure it influenced Edgar's writing, but who sends their kid to that kind of school? I'm not sure that the Allens knew that that was what was happening. It was far away. But then when I came back, I was sent to another school in the States, in Virginia, and it was very unruly, and it wasn't in the graveyard, but it wasn't a whole lot better. It wasn't that close to the Allens, and they sent me with no money and no food and no money to get food. So I gambled to try to eat and clothe myself, and that didn't work out so well because I wasn't a very good gambler. And another of my threads seems to be epilepsy. And I think Edgar had epilepsy. I have epilepsy now, and it took me over 40 years to figure it out. And it took doctors that long also to diagnose me and figure out what was going on. Plus, epilepsy gets worse as you get older. So when you're young, you could show no signs of having epilepsy, and all of a sudden as you get older, it can affect you. People said he was a boozer. He may have been, but I also heard stories about Edgar not being able to handle more than one drink, which would explain some other things. Because if he was epileptic, perhaps some of these fits that people thought were drunken fits were epileptic seizures. He showed up at the White House with all disheveled once with his cloak on inside out, and I know that stress causes seizures, and I'm sure he had a seizure before he went to the White House, and maybe he had a drink but didn't handle alcohol well. I do think he may have had an opium problem, because he may have found opium to help with his seizures, or at least help mask them. I, in this lifetime, had a terrible bout with the loss of some really close friends in the 90s to opioids. And I stay far away from them. I don't like to take them even if they're prescribed. When I had my children, they gave me some Percocet. It's an opioid. I cut them in half. I took half of what I was supposed to until I couldn't function, and then I had to take a little bit more. But I was scared of them because I lost friends to opioids. I lost close friends and Jerry Garcia. So I really was frightened of that addiction that I knew was there somehow. I think Edgar might have had a opium problem, which would have exacerbated or masked his seizures, and then would have made him not realize what had happened. He wouldn't have remembered any of his seizures, so he couldn't accurately count them or say how long they lasted or tell a doctor about them, because he didn't know they existed. He didn't know they were happening. It's really hard to know you're having a seizure when you're having a seizure. It's really hard to know, especially as a child, that you're having a seizure when you're having a seizure. So I think a lot of the people I've been were epileptic, and I think Edgar was epileptic, and I know I'm epileptic. So then Edgar went to West Point. Well, he joined the Army briefly and then went to West Point. And he joined the Army mainly to try to pay his debts, his gambling debts. And then he went to West Point. And the thing they don't write about, and the thing he didn't directly write about, was that the Civil War pretty much started during his math class. And he was pitted against Jimmy, who he'd been just sitting next to reading a book. Except both Jimmy and Edgar had guns now, and they were told to shoot each other. Out in the field. Go play, boys. A lot of people don't realize that that's how the Civil War started, but it's how the Civil War started. At West Point, student pitted against student in the field. Edgar had a lot of enemies. I think it came from that. The students were told to pick sides. And they started a huge conflict that they knew nothing about. I'm making this on the anniversary of January 6th. Kind of the same thing happened. Those Proud Boys and whatever, they may have thought they were doing service for the president, but they were just like those boys. Math class. And realistically, I remember being told which side I was on based on where I had come from. Because I came from north of the university, or the school, I was on one side. Boys who came from south of the school were on the other. It wasn't like you had a choice or you were given, a list of reasons, or anybody talked about slavery, or there wasn't any of that. So Edgar was a writer, knowing all this stuff about his government, about his school. And his death is, just as mysterious as his life was. He was moving to New York to start a magazine. He was taking the train from Maryland to New York. No, he was taking the train from further south, I think Virginia, to New York. He had to take a steamer thing and stuff, but mainly he took a train. And in Baltimore, he was waylaid by people who had been on the train with him. And they sort of ushered him out of the train. And they bought him these lemonades that they didn't say had booze in them. They were election lemonades. They had a lot of booze in them, and they had drugs in them. And these people were about the business of, rigging the election, basically. And they were making people vote more than once. And they took me off the train and made me miss my next train and to New York. And they took me to this bar that was also a polling place. Strangely enough. Gee, I wonder why we don't do that anymore. And, I was already clearly drunk if they convinced me to miss my train before I even got off the train. Then they had me vote in other people's clothes. They got me totally wasted and drugged, and I think they beat me up because I'm pretty sure I fought them. Like, I knew I was not supposed to vote twice in someone else's clothes and in someone else's name or whatever. I knew that I wasn't supposed to, and they were forcing me to, and they beat me. I was beaten about the head. And I believe it was like swelling inside under my cranium that and they could have just given me a anti-inflammatory, but this was 1849, so they didn't. And I was found in the gutter in someone else's clothes, and right outside that bar that had been a polling place. Then I was taken to the hospital in a horse and carriage. I remember that being bumpy. My head was very swollen and it hurt. And I don't think I even woke up. I just remember bumpy. And then in the hospital, I woke up briefly and I said Reynolds. And people have wondered why I said Reynolds. And I think, and I don't know, I've tried to look this up and figure out exactly what happened, but I think Mr. Allen left his fortune to the original Reynolds, R.J. Reynolds, who sells cigarettes still to this day. He was a tobacco guy, Mr. Allen was, and he did not leave his fortune to Edgar. He had some illegitimate children. I think R.J. Reynolds was one of his illegitimate children, and I think he left his tobacco fortune to Reynolds, and I think that is why I yelled out Reynolds. But not only that, I think what Edgar was finding out, and the reason why he was singled out, taken off the train, and made to vote a bunch of times and killed, they meant to kill him. He wasn't supposed to live through that. They thought they killed him and threw him in the gutter, but he ended up being alive for long enough to say Reynolds. And I think Reynolds was the person that arranged to have me beaten and vote more than once, and because he was trying to besmirch my name and kill me, because he and I were in sort of conflict, because he was like my brother almost, but not. So, I believe that they knew way back then in 1849 that tobacco would kill people, and that they proceeded anyway. And that's another reason why he yelled out Reynolds, because Reynolds was dirty in so many different ways, and he was the one that had his father's, well, Mr. Allen's fortune. Wasn't his father. But he later did meet up with his aunt, who was his father's sister, and he was taken in by his aunt, and her daughter, Virginia, has been the subject of controversy. But Edgar had no other relatives, and Virginia's mom was going to marry her off to a really old man with a lot of money. And Edgar didn't want her to have to be married off to a really old man with a lot of money. And he wanted to adopt her as his daughter. And her mother didn't want Edgar to do that. She said that that wouldn't be appropriate, and that she was past that age, and that at her age she's to be married. And even though she was 13 at that time, that was how they did things. And so Edgar married Virginia to keep her with her mom and with Edgar, and he promised them that he would take care of them. And he did. He took care of them. Not great, but he did his best. So his mom died. His childhood friend's mom died. His wife, Virginia, who he raised like a daughter, dies in his cloak. So he has this thing with these women in his life that die. And I think he thought that marrying Virginia would keep her alive, because all the women that died around him weren't married to him. Nonetheless, Edgar explains a lot about my current character and my gloominess in past lives and my gloominess in this life. And I'm an awkward male when I show up here as a male, because I've mostly been female. So Edgar was no exception. He was awkward. He was awkward. So another thing I do every week here at Fireside Tales is play a version of Deja Vu by David Crosby, because I feel it's a song about reincarnation. Though I don't feel that the concept of deja vu is necessarily about reincarnation. I think when you're in a place that you've never been in this lifetime, and there's no way you could have been there before, but you get there and you've been there before. You know what's around the next corner. You know what the buildings looked like 20 years ago. You know certain things about the place. That's deja vu that is related to past lives and reincarnation. But when you have like those little snippets of time where everything happens a certain way and you've seen it happen that certain way before. That, I think, is from our dreams. If I had ever been here before, I would probably know just what to do. Don't you? If I had ever been here before and another time around the wheel, I would probably know just how to deal with all of you. And I feel like I've been here before. Feel like I've been here before, and you know, it makes me wonder what's going on under the ground. Do you know? Don't you wonder? What's going on down under you? La da da, la da da, la da da da. La da 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 da. Well, thanks for watching. Have a weird and wonderful weekend.